The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Atlanta International Airport as Staff Sergeant James Anderson adjusted his military cap in the terminal's restroom mirror. His reflection showed a man who'd aged beyond his 28 years, with eyes that had seen too much during his 3 tours of duty. Still, his uniform was perfectly pressed, his boots polished to a mirror shine. Old habits that stayed with him even as he prepared to return to civilian life. He'd been dreaming of this moment for months, heading home to Chicago to surprise his mother, who had no idea he was coming. The thought of her face lighting up when he walked through the door made all those long nights in foreign lands worth it. She'd been sending him care packages filled with her famous chocolate chip cookies throughout his deployment, and now it was his turn to bring her something special, a delicate glass figurine he carefully wrapped in his carry-on bag. The airport buzzed with activity around him. Business people rushed past with their briefcases, families herded excited children toward their gates, and airline staff moved efficiently through the crowds. James took it all in, appreciating the ordinary moments of American life he'd missed while serving overseas. He'd used his accumulated military points to treat himself to a first-class ticket, a small luxury he felt he'd earned after everything he'd been through. As he walked toward his gate, a small boy, maybe 5 or 6 years old, stopped and stared at him with wide-eyed wonder. James smiled and gave him a friendly salute, which the boy returned with enthusiastic, if imperfect, form. The boy's mother smiled appreciatively and guided her son along, but not before the child declared, "I want to be just like him when I grow up." The moment warmed James's heart. It was good to be home. Reaching into his pocket, he felt the carefully folded ticket and ran his finger along its edge. First class. He'd never flown first class before, and he was looking forward to starting his journey home in comfort. The past few years had been filled with rough transport vehicles, cramped cargo planes, and too many sleepless nights on hard ground. Today, he was going to travel like a gentleman. At the gate, the boarding process was already underway. James stood patiently in line, observing the mix of passengers around him. A young couple whispered and giggled together, probably heading off on their honeymoon. An older businessman argued quietly into his phone about some urgent deal. A mother tried to comfort her crying baby while simultaneously searching for her boarding pass. It was a slice of normal American life that felt almost surreal after so much time away. As he waited, James pulled out the small photo he always carried with him, a picture of his family taken the day he first enlisted. His mother stood proud but worried, his younger sister beaming with excitement, and his father, gone now 2 years, with his hand firmly on James's shoulder. The photo was worn around the edges from the countless times he'd pulled it out during difficult moments overseas. Today, he was finally heading back to make new memories with the family he had left. The gate agent's voice crackled over the intercom, calling for first-class passengers to board. James carefully tucked the photo away and stepped forward, ticket in hand. The agent's eyes went from his ticket to his uniform, and she offered him a genuine smile. "Thank you for your service, Staff Sergeant," she said warmly, checking his boarding pass. "Welcome aboard." Walking down the jet bridge, James felt a mix of emotions he couldn't quite name. Pride in having served his country, relief at being home, excitement about surprising his mother, and a touch of anxiety about adjusting to civilian life again. The sound of his boots on the metal walkway echoed with each step, carrying him closer to home. The plane's interior greeted him with that distinctive new aircraft smell, a mix of leather, coffee, and possibility. First class looked exactly as he'd imagined: wide, comfortable seats, extra legroom, and an air of luxury he'd only seen in magazines. His seat was 2C, right by the window. Perfect for watching America pass beneath him as he made his way home. As other passengers began boarding, James settled into his seat, carefully placing his carry-on with the precious glass figurine in the overhead compartment. He'd chosen it specifically because it reminded him of the little glass animals his mother collected on her windowsill. Each one had a story, she always said, and now he was bringing her a new story, a piece of the world he'd seen. The flight attendants moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, checking seats and storing bags. One of them, noticing his uniform, stopped to offer him a pre-flight beverage. "It's the least we can do," she said with a kind smile, handing him a glass of water. James thanked her, appreciating the small gesture of recognition. Looking out the window, he could see the ground crew finishing their preparations. The late afternoon sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, a beautiful Georgia sunset to bid him farewell. In just a few hours, he'd be home in Chicago, walking through familiar streets, breathing in the lake air, and most importantly, hugging his mother. Little did James know that this routine flight home was about to become something much more significant. As the remaining passengers filed onto the plane, he couldn't have anticipated the events that were about to unfold, events that would test his dignity, challenge his rights, and ultimately contribute to a larger story of change in America. The plane had nearly finished boarding when an elegantly dressed older woman approached row 2. She wore a pearl necklace that caught the cabin lights, and her silver hair was perfectly styled beneath a small hat. Her designer handbag probably cost more than 3 months of James's military salary. She paused at the row, checking her ticket, then gave James a quick glance that turned into an uncomfortable stare. James stood up politely to let her reach her seat, just as his mother had taught him, always be courteous, no matter the circumstance. But the woman didn't move. Instead, she clutched her handbag tighter and looked around as if searching for help. Her eyes finally landed on a young flight attendant walking past. "Excuse me, miss," the woman called out, her voice carrying that particular tone of someone used to getting their way. "There seems to be some confusion about the seating arrangements." She spoke in a stage whisper that somehow managed to be heard by everyone nearby. "I don't mean to cause any trouble, but surely there's been a mistake." The flight attendant, whose name tag read Betty, approached with a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was young, probably in her early 20s, and her hands fidgeted slightly with her uniform as she sized up the situation. "How may I help you, ma'am?" The woman leaned in closer to Betty, though her whisper remained perfectly audible. "I paid good money for this first-class ticket. Surely you understand that I cannot be expected to." She glanced at James, then back to Betty. "Well, you understand my concern." James remained standing, his face calm despite the familiar sting of the situation. He'd faced enemy fire without flinching, but somehow these moments on home soil always cut deeper. His hand instinctively moved to touch the pocket where he kept his family photo, a gesture that had become a source of strength. Betty's smile became strained as she glanced between James and the woman. "Ma'am, I assure you all our seating assignments are correct." She lowered her voice, though not enough. "Perhaps we could find you another seat if you're uncomfortable." James cleared his throat softly. "Ma'am," he addressed Betty, his voice steady and dignified, "I have a valid first-class ticket for seat 2C. I earned it with my military points after serving 3 tours of duty." He pulled out his ticket as proof, though he shouldn't have needed to. Other passengers were beginning to take notice. A businessman across the aisle pretended to be deeply absorbed in his newspaper, but his eyes weren't moving across the pages. A young couple a few rows back whispered to each other, their faces showing a mix of embarrassment and concern. In the main cabin, several heads poked out into the aisle to see what was causing the delay. The woman's voice rose slightly. "Well, in my day, people knew their proper place." She turned to Betty again. "Surely you can sort this out? I'm a frequent flyer, you know. I've been flying this airline for 30 years. Betty shifted uncomfortably, looking like she wished she could disappear into the airplane's carpet. She was new to the job. This much was clear from her uncertainty and the slight tremor in her hands. "Sir," she turned to James, her voice apologetic but pleading, "we do have some seats available in the main cabin. Would you mind?" James felt his chest tighten, but kept his voice level. "I would mind, actually. I have a right to the seat I purchased, just like any other passenger." He thought of his mother, who had always taught him to stand up for himself, but to do it with grace. "I've served my country to protect everyone's rights, ma'am, including the right to sit in the seat I paid for." A few passengers had begun to murmur, some nodding in agreement with James's words. The woman's face flushed red, either from embarrassment or anger, possibly both. She clutched her handbag even tighter, her knuckles turning white around the handle. "Well, she repeated, her voice rising further. "I'll have you know my husband is very well connected. I'll be writing to the airline about this, and if this flight is delayed because of this situation, everyone will know exactly why." James remained standing straight and tall in his military uniform, the medals on his chest catching the cabin light. Each one told a story of service, of sacrifice, of fighting for the very freedoms this woman took for granted. He thought about all his fellow soldiers, of every color and background, who had fought side by side, bled together, saved each other's lives without ever once questioning anyone's proper place. The tension in the cabin was palpable. Other passengers had stopped pretending not to watch. Betty looked close to tears, caught between company policy, customer service, and what she knew in her heart was right. The woman's face had grown even redder, and she fanned herself with her ticket, creating a small breeze that carried the scent of expensive perfume. What nobody had noticed yet was the distinguished-looking gentleman across the aisle who had set aside his newspaper and was watching the scene unfold with keen interest. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes missed nothing. He sat silently, observing every word, every gesture, every reaction from those involved and those watching. The situation had reached a crossroads, and everyone could feel it. The next few moments would determine more than just seating arrangements. They would reveal something essential about who they were as people, as a society. The air felt heavy with the weight of this simple yet profound confrontation, a microcosm of the larger struggles playing out across the nation. Across the aisle, Judge William Parker sat quietly observing the scene unfold before him. His wire-rimmed glasses rested low on his nose as he watched with the careful attention he'd developed over 30 years on the federal bench. He'd seen countless cases of discrimination in his courtroom, but there was something particularly poignant about witnessing it happen in real time, raw and unfiltered by legal procedures. The judge had boarded the plane early, settling into his seat with the latest issue of the Law Review. He'd noticed the soldier immediately. Hard to miss in that crisp uniform with all those medals. The young man carried himself with dignity, reminding the judge of his own son who was serving overseas. When the elderly woman had arrived and the situation began to develop, he'd set aside his reading material, recognizing that something significant was about to unfold. Now, he watched as the flight attendant, Betty, twisted her hands nervously in her uniform. She kept glancing toward the back of the plane, probably hoping her supervisor would appear and take this difficult decision off her shoulders. The elderly woman continued her protests, her voice growing louder with each passing moment, while the soldier maintained his composure with remarkable grace under pressure. Judge Parker noticed the small details that others might miss. He saw how the soldier's hand occasionally touched his chest pocket, as if drawing strength from something kept there. He observed the subtle reactions of other passengers, the way some avoided eye contact while others showed clear support in their expressions. He noted how the young couple a few rows back held hands tighter, sharing looks of concern and whispered conversations. The judge had spent decades interpreting the law, but he'd learned that the most important moments often happened outside the courtroom. Real change didn't always come from official rulings and legal precedents. Sometimes it came from ordinary people standing up for what was right, from small acts of courage that rippled outward to touch countless lives. As he watched, he thought about the cases crossing his desk lately. Just last week, he'd reviewed 3 separate incidents of discrimination in public transportation. The laws were changing, but old habits and prejudices died hard. This scene playing out before him was a perfect example of how paper laws needed real-world enforcement to have any meaning. A flight attendant passed by, offering him a pre-flight beverage. He declined with a polite smile, not wanting to miss any detail of what was happening. The elderly woman was now threatening to call her husband, who apparently sat on some important board somewhere. The judge had heard similar threats countless times in his courtroom, people who believed their connections and social status put them above the law. He noticed how the soldier's military boots were perfectly polished, how his uniform bore no wrinkles despite the long day of travel. This was clearly a man who took pride in his service, who respected the uniform he wore and what it represented. The contrast between his dignified bearing and the woman's increasingly undignified behavior was striking. Other passengers had begun to shift restlessly in their seats. The flight was already running a few minutes behind schedule. A businessman checked his watch and sighed loudly. A mother in the main cabin tried to quiet her curious child, who kept asking why everyone was upset. The tension in the air was thick enough to touch. Judge Parker considered his role in this moment. He had the authority to intervene, to remind everyone about recent federal legislation regarding discrimination in public transportation. His word as a federal judge would carry significant weight. But timing was everything, in the courtroom and in life. Sometimes letting a situation develop fully could lead to more meaningful change than rushing to resolve it. He watched as another passenger, an elderly gentleman, removed his hat respectfully when passing the soldier to reach his seat in the next row. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. The judge noticed how this simple act of respect caused the protesting woman to falter slightly in her complaints, though she quickly resumed her demands. From his vantage point, he could see down the aisle into the main cabin. Word of what was happening had clearly spread. Passengers were standing up to get a better view, whispering among themselves. Some looked angry, others embarrassed, and a few seemed to be finding their own courage in watching the soldier's quiet dignity. The air felt heavy with the weight of the moment. Judge Parker had presided over enough cases to know when a situation was approaching its turning point. This was more than just a dispute over airplane seating. It was a moment that would stick in the memories of everyone present, a story they would tell their children and grandchildren about where they were when someone took a stand. He noticed how the sunlight streaming through the airplane windows cast long shadows across the aisle, like nature itself was drawing a line between right and wrong. The soldier stood on the bright side of that line, his medals catching the light and gleaming. The judge knew that soon he would need to make his presence known, to add the weight of the law to what was already written in every person's conscience. James stood firm at his assigned seat, drawing on the same inner strength that had carried him through 3 tours of duty. The medals on his chest felt heavier than usual, each one a reminder of the freedoms he'd fought to protect. Freedoms that should extend to every American, including the right to sit in a seat they'd rightfully purchased. "Ma'am," he addressed the flight attendant again, his voice calm but firm. "I understand you're in a difficult position, but I cannot and will not give up this seat. My father taught me that a man's dignity isn't something he can give away, even a little bit." He touched the pocket holding his family photo, thinking of his father's words on the day he enlisted. The elderly woman's face had turned an alarming shade of red. "Well," she huffed, her pearl necklace bouncing with each agitated movement. "I've never been so insulted in all my life. First, you refused to accommodate a lady's reasonable request, and now you're being stubborn about it." She turned to other passengers, seeking support, but found most eyes carefully averted. Betty, the young flight attendant, looked close to tears. Her hands trembled as she held her clipboard, caught between company policy and basic human decency. "Sir, please," she almost whispered, "I don't want to have to call security." A ripple of murmurs went through the cabin at her words. From the main cabin, someone called out, "Let the soldier sit." Another voice added, "He fought for our country." The support warmed James's heart, but he kept his expression neutral. This wasn't about winning or losing, it was about standing up for what was right. "My mother," James spoke clearly but gently, "always told me that true courtesy means treating everyone with respect, not just those who look like you." He smiled slightly, remembering how she drilled these lessons into him and his sister at the dinner table. "She also taught me that sometimes being courteous means standing your ground when something isn't right." The woman clutched her handbag tighter, knuckles white with tension. "Your mother clearly didn't teach you proper respect for your betters." She snapped, then immediately seemed to realize she'd gone too far. Several passengers gasped. Even Betty took a step back, shocked by the openly hostile statement. James felt a flash of anger at the insult to his mother, but kept his composure. "My mother, ma'am, taught me that no one is better than anyone else. She raised me to be proud of who I am, to serve my country with honor, and to face injustice with dignity." His voice carried clearly through the now silent cabin. "And that's exactly what I'm doing right now." A baby started crying somewhere in the main cabin, its wails cutting through the tension. The sound reminded James of all the innocent children he'd seen in war zones, children who didn't care about the color of the soldier protecting them, who just wanted to feel safe. Here he was, back home, fighting a different kind of battle. "The flight is already delayed," Betty said anxiously, checking her watch. "If we don't resolve this soon—" She left the sentence hanging, but everyone understood the implications. The woman seized on this immediately. "You see?" she declared triumphantly. "He's holding up the entire flight. making all these good people late for their connections. Is that what you want, young man? To inconvenience everyone just to prove a point. James remained steady. The only person holding up this flight, ma'am, is the one refusing to sit in their assigned seat next to a uniformed soldier of the United States military. His words hung in the air, simple but powerful. Several passengers nodded in agreement. The tension in the cabin had reached a breaking point. An older gentleman, a few rows back, stood up, his voice carrying clearly, "I'll trade seats with the lady if she's so concerned." This offer seemed to fluster the woman even more. Now she'd have to either accept and admit her prejudice openly, or refuse and reveal that her issue wasn't really about seating arrangements at all. Through it all, James maintained his military bearing, standing straight and proud. He thought about all his fellow soldiers, men of every background who'd shared foxholes and combat rations, who'd saved each other's lives without once thinking about the color of the hand reaching out to help them. If they could forge such bonds under fire, surely people could share a peaceful airplane cabin. The woman opened and closed her mouth several times, searching for words. Her carefully constructed world of privilege and prejudice was crumbling in front of a plane full of witnesses. Finally, she managed to sputter, "This is outrageous. I'll be writing to the airline. I'll be writing to the newspapers. I'll be writing to my congressman." A younger passenger called out from the main cabin, "Maybe write to the army too. Tell them how one of their decorated soldiers ruined your day by existing." This drew several chuckles from the crowd, though James kept his expression neutral. He hadn't wanted to become the center of attention or to create a scene. He just wanted to fly home to surprise his mother, sitting in the seat he'd earned through his service. Just as the situation seemed ready to boil over, a calm, authoritative voice cut through the tension like a knife through butter. "Excuse me," the distinguished gentleman from across the aisle spoke up, closing his law journal. "I believe I can help clarify the legal situation here." The cabin fell silent as Judge Parker stood, his presence commanding immediate attention. He'd adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and smoothed his tie, small gestures that somehow added weight to his next words. "I'm Federal Judge William Parker, and I've been observing this situation with great interest." The elderly woman's expression shifted from righteous indignation to uncertainty. Her perfectly manicured hand flew to her pearl necklace, fingering it nervously. Betty, the flight attendant, straightened her uniform unconsciously, sensing that something significant was about to happen. "Young lady," the judge addressed Betty kindly but firmly, "are you aware of the recent federal legislation regarding discrimination in public transportation?" His voice was measured, the same tone he used in his courtroom to educate rather than intimidate. Betty's eyes widened. Well, we had some training, but," she stammered, looking increasingly uncomfortable. The judge nodded understandingly. "Let me refresh everyone's memory," he continued, speaking to the entire cabin now. "The law is quite clear on this matter. Any business offering public transportation cannot discriminate based on race, color, religion, or national origin. This includes airlines." He paused, letting his words sink in. "This isn't just company policy, it's federal law." The woman clutched her handbag tighter, her knuckles white. "But surely, Your Honor, you understand that some arrangements are more traditional." Her voice trailed off as she realized how weak her argument sounded in the face of legal authority. Judge Parker's expression remained neutral, but his eyes held a fierce intensity. "Madam, I've spent 30 years on the federal bench. I've seen how tradition has been used to justify all manner of injustice, but tradition doesn't trump law, and it certainly doesn't trump human dignity." A murmur of approval rippled through the cabin. James remained standing, his military bearing perfect, though his expression softened slightly with gratitude for this unexpected support. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "this young man is a decorated soldier who has served our country with distinction." He gestured to James's medals. "He has fought to protect the very freedoms we all enjoy, including the freedom to travel without discrimination." The irony of denying him his rightful seat should not be lost on anyone here. The woman's face flushed deeper, but now with embarrassment rather than anger. Several passengers nodded in agreement with the judge's words. A younger passenger near the back even started to clap, though the sound quickly died away in the tension of the moment. "Your Honor," Betty spoke up, her voice steadier now, "what would you recommend we do in this situation?" She seemed relieved to have someone of authority taking charge. The judge smiled kindly. The solution is simple. Staff Sergeant Anderson has a valid first-class ticket for Seat 2C. He has every legal and moral right to sit in that seat. Any attempt to move him based on his race would be a direct violation of federal law, something I'm sure this airline wishes to avoid. He turned to address the elderly woman directly. Madam, you have two choices. You may take your assigned seat next to this honorable soldier, or you may choose to take a later flight. Those are your only legal options. His tone was firm but not unkind, the same tone he used when explaining the law to anyone in his courtroom. The cabin had grown so quiet you could hear the distant hum of the engines. Everyone waited to see how the woman would respond. Her world of privilege and prejudice had just collided head-on with federal law, and the impact had left her visibly shaken. A few rows back, a mother whispered something to her young daughter, who watched the scene with wide, curious eyes. It was the kind of moment that could shape a child's understanding of right and wrong, justice and injustice. James stood patiently through it all, his dignity intact. The photo in his pocket seemed to press against his heart, reminding him of his family's pride in his service. His mother had always taught him that change happens one person, one moment at a time. Perhaps this was one of those moments. The judge remained standing, a living symbol of law and justice in an everyday situation. His presence reminded everyone that grand principles of equality weren't just for courtrooms and history books, they were meant for ordinary moments on ordinary days, like this one on a delayed flight from Atlanta to Chicago. Betty held her clipboard close, waiting to see what would happen next. The delay was adding up, but somehow that seemed less important now. This had become about something bigger than an on-time departure. It had become about standing up for what was right, about making sure that words like justice and equality meant something in the real world. The elderly woman's transformation happened slowly, like ice melting in the sun. First came the slight drop of her shoulders as the fight drained out of her. Then her grip on her expensive handbag loosened, and finally, her face softened from anger to something closer to shame. The realization that a federal judge had witnessed her behavior seemed to crack the shell of her prejudice. I didn't mean, she began, her voice much quieter now. She looked around the cabin, seeing the faces of other passengers for what felt like the first time. Young and old, different backgrounds, all watching this moment unfold. The mother with her curious child, the businessman who'd set aside his newspaper, the young couple holding hands, all witnesses to her very public confrontation with her own prejudices. Betty, the flight attendant, stepped forward with newfound confidence. The judge's presence had given her the backbone she needed. "Ma'am," she said gently, "would you like to take your seat? Or should I help you arrange for another flight?" Her voice was professional now, without the earlier tremor of uncertainty. The woman glanced at James, still standing tall in his military uniform, then at Judge Parker, who watched with the patient expression of someone who had seen many such moments of transformation in his courtroom. She smoothed her expensive dress with trembling hands. She swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll take my seat." The words seemed to cost her something, but as she said them, her shoulders straightened slightly, as if setting down a heavy burden she carried for too long. A soft murmur of approval rippled through the cabin. James stepped aside to let her into the row, maintaining his dignified bearing. As she settled into her seat, she kept her eyes forward, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Judge Parker nodded approvingly and returned to his own seat, though he kept his law journal closed, watching as the situation continued to unfold. The cabin crew began their final preparations for takeoff, moving through the aisles with renewed purpose. James sat down in his rightful seat, carefully arranging his uniform. The woman beside him stared straight ahead, her breath coming in short, uncomfortable bursts. The silence between them felt heavy with unspoken words. Then something unexpected happened. A young girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, walked up from the main cabin with her mother's encouragement. She carried a small pack of cookies from her travel snacks. Standing in the aisle next to James's seat, she held them out shyly. "Thank you for protecting our country," she said in a clear voice that carried through the quiet cabin. Her innocent gesture cut through the tension like a ray of sunlight through storm clouds. James smiled warmly, accepting the cookies with genuine gratitude. "Thank you, young lady," "That's very kind of you." The girl beamed and hurried back to her mother, who hugged her proudly. The elderly woman watched this exchange from the corner of her eye. Something in her expression shifted, softened. She reached into her expensive handbag and pulled out a tissue, dabbing at her eyes. "My grandson," she said suddenly, her voice quiet but clear. "He's in the military too." It was the first personal thing she'd said since the confrontation began. "He's stationed overseas right now." James turned to her with gentle attention. "Which branch?" he asked softly. "Marines," she replied, her voice catching slightly. "I worry about him every day." "The Marines are a fine branch of service, ma'am," James said kindly. "I served alongside many brave Marines." Other passengers watched in amazement as these two people, who moments ago had been locked in conflict, began a quiet conversation about military service, family, and worry for loved ones far from home. It was as if a wall had crumbled, revealing the shared humanity on both sides. Betty walked past, offering them both a warm smile as she checked their seatbelts. The delayed flight was finally ready for takeoff. Passengers settled into their seats, some still glancing toward the front of first class, witnessing the small miracle of transformation. The woman pulled out a small photo from her wallet, her grandson in his Marine uniform, proud and young. She showed it to James with trembling hands. "This was at his graduation from boot camp," she explained, her voice carrying a grandmother's pride that transcended all other barriers. James looked at the photo with genuine interest, sharing a brief story about his own boot camp experience that made the woman laugh softly. The sound of her laughter seemed to surprise her, as if she hadn't expected to find any common ground with the man she tried so hard to avoid sitting next to. As the plane's engines roared to life, preparing for takeoff, the cabin felt different. Something had shifted, not just for the woman and James, but for everyone who had witnessed this moment. It was a reminder that change was possible, that hearts could soften, that understanding could bloom in the most unexpected places. Years passed, but the impact of that flight from Atlanta to Chicago rippled outward like waves in a pond. Judge Parker never forgot the quiet dignity of the soldier or the transformation he witnessed that day. The incident became a touchstone in his future civil rights cases, a real-world example he would reference when explaining how change happens in everyday moments. 6 months after the flight, the judge was presiding over a landmark discrimination case involving public transportation. During his ruling, he spoke about what he'd witnessed on that plane. "Change," he said, "doesn't always come from courtroom decisions or legislative acts. Sometimes it comes from ordinary people choosing to stand up for what's right, from small moments of courage that inspire others to be better." The airline took notice too. Betty, the young flight attendant, wrote a detailed report about the incident. It made its way up the corporate ladder, eventually landing on the desk of the company's training director. Within a year, the airline had completely revamped its customer service training, using the story as a case study in handling discrimination and standing up for what's right. James continued his life's journey, eventually becoming a respected community leader in Chicago. The glass figurine he carried so carefully made it safely to his mother's windowsill, where it caught the sunlight alongside her other precious collectibles. But more importantly, he carried the story of that flight with him, sharing it when needed, using it to teach others about dignity and standing firm in the face of injustice. One day, years later, he visited a local high school to speak about his military service. After sharing stories about his time overseas, a student raised her hand and asked about his most memorable experience. James smiled, thinking back to that flight. He told them about the confrontation, the judge's intervention, and most importantly, about the transformation he witnessed. But the most powerful part, he explained to the attentive students, wasn't winning the right to sit in that seat. It was watching someone's heart change, seeing them move from hatred to understanding. The woman and I talked throughout that flight about our families, our hopes, our fears. By the time we landed in Chicago, we'd found our common humanity. The elderly woman had kept her word about writing letters, but not in the way she'd originally threatened. Instead, she wrote to the airline praising James's dignity and apologizing for her behavior. She wrote to her congressman too, but instead of complaining, she advocated for stronger civil rights protections. Her transformation went beyond that single flight. It changed how she saw the world. The young girl who had offered James her cookies grew up to become a civil rights attorney. Years later, when interviewed about what inspired her career choice, she talked about witnessing that moment on the plane. "I learned more about justice and courage in those few minutes," she said, "than in any classroom." The story found its way into training materials not just for airlines, but for police departments, schools, and businesses. It became an example of how confronting prejudice with dignity can lead to real change, how standing firm doesn't mean standing hostile, and how transformation is possible even in the most unlikely moments. James's mother kept the newspaper clipping about the incident in her family Bible. She would take it out sometimes, showing visitors with pride how her son had handled himself that day. "My boy," she would say, her eyes shining, "he remembered what I taught him about dignity. But more than that, he taught others about it too." On his retirement from community service years later, James received letters from people who had been on that flight. One came from a businessman who had watched everything unfold from a few rows back. "I was a coward that day," he wrote. "I sat silently while you stood up for what was right. But your example changed me. I've spent the years since then finding my own courage to speak up when I see injustice." The impact continued to spread in ways no one could have predicted. The story was passed down in families, shared in classrooms, and retold in moments when people needed inspiration to stand up for what was right. It became more than just an incident on a plane. It became a reminder that every person has the power to create change through their actions. Even the judge in his final years on the bench would often reflect on that day. "In 30 years of law," he would tell his clerks, "I've seen how legal decisions can change society. But that day on the plane showed me how individual courage and dignity can change hearts. Sometimes that's where the real transformation begins." The legacy of that flight lived on not just in policy changes or training manuals, but in the countless small moments when people chose courage over comfort, dignity over discrimination, and understanding over hatred. It became a testament to how a single moment of standing up for what's right can create ripples that continue to touch lives for generations to come.